Hey there, my friend. I'm so happy you dropped by. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and share this video with your loved ones. It means the world to me. Tell me where you're watching from, your city or country. I truly enjoy reading every comment. Now let's dive in. Samuel stepped through the front door earlier than usual that Tuesday. The evening held the promise of familiar comforts. Dinner with the kids, a steamy shower, maybe a bit of TV, and the quiet intimacy that closed each day. Everything appeared as it should, but something in the air felt unsettled, a tension he couldn't quite define. Marina seemed distant, even more than her recent norm. Her eyes wandered the room like they were searching for some invisible anchor. She stood before the mirror, brushing her hair with a mechanical rhythm, her face shadowed by something more than fatigue. This wasn't the look of a long day. It was a silence that hinted at weightier things. Samuel, lounging in the armchair near the bed, watched her without a word. He had always thought her beautiful, even on the days when presence was all they could offer one another. But tonight, there was something in the way she avoided his gaze that set a small alarm ringing in him. Before he could speak, she turned toward him with slow deliberation and said, "There's something I need to tell you." Her words hit the room like a dropped glass, soft, but shattering. Her voice was steady, too steady, the kind that came from rehearsing painful truths over and over in your head. Samuel inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He wasn't expecting catastrophe, but those words never delivered anything benign. He gave a subtle nod, granting her the space to continue. Then came the bombshell. Gavin had returned. For a moment, Samuel thought he'd misheard. Gavin Flynn. Not just a name, but the name. The man Marina had almost married over a decade ago. The one who could have been a father to the daughters now asleep down the hall. He was supposed to be ancient history, but now he was here, real, present, reintroduced into their lives. Samuel remained still. Composure was his armor. He didn't rage or unravel. "And?" he asked, measured. That's when Marina added the piece that shifted everything. They worked together now. Same office building, same floor, shared spaces, the occasional lunch, accidental conversations that left a trace of laughter. She delivered this information with calculated calm, each syllable carefully chosen like a drop of water falling from a tilted cup. But the cup had already tipped. The damage was done. Samuel sat in silence, his jaw clenched. Beneath the surface, it felt like the ground was subtly buckling. Outwardly, he didn't move. He had walked into an emotional minefield unprepared. With every word, another detonation. Marina admitted she hadn't told him sooner because she feared how he'd take it. And more tellingly, she hadn't quite figured out her own emotions yet. Samuel didn't dance around it. He asked the core question. "Did you see him outside of work?" She hesitated. Barely a second. But enough. He already knew. When she confirmed they'd met for lunch a few times, he dropped his gaze. There was no need to press further. The truth had fallen between them like an Arctic wall. What Marina didn't fully grasp, or maybe did, but couldn't bear to face, was that Samuel had already started piecing things together. His assistant Tabitha, observant and loyal, had raised quiet concerns. Marina staying out later. Long lunches, odd timings, puzzles that didn't quite fit until now. Tabitha hadn't been accusatory, just honest. She'd seen good men blindsided before and didn't want to stand by again, and now Marina's confession confirmed it all. Doubt crystallized into certainty. A cold bitterness seeped in. It was betrayal, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd never known that feeling in their 12 years. Marina tried to soften the edges, offered assurances. It meant nothing. It was innocent. But once trust fractures, the shape of the break matters less than the fact of it. It's there. You can't unsee it. He saw it now, in her eyes, in the faint ripple disturbing what once felt so solid between them. Slowly, Samuel rose and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. Everything out there looked untouched. Parked cars, streetlights casting soft glows, the branches swaying in the night air. But inside, something fundamental had broken. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He didn't even show pain. He just turned and said, almost gently, "You should have told me sooner." Then came the silence. Heavy, charged, the kind that holds too much. The next words mattered, because this wasn't just about Gavin walking back into their world. Something else had resurfaced, too. Something Marina had buried long ago, convinced it was gone for good. Now it was back, challenging everything they'd built together over 12 years. And perhaps the most unsettling part? The creeping sense that this was only the start. Marina stayed seated on the edge of the bed, eyes pinned to the floor, searching for an answer it couldn't give. Her posture sagged as she nervously traced the folds of the sheets, fingertips gliding over each wrinkle as if they were wounds her voice had just inflicted. The bedroom, once a haven of peace and intimacy, had turned suffocating in an instant. Familiar objects, a framed snapshot from their last trip, the unread book gathering dust on the nightstand, the pillow Samuel used to ease his back, suddenly seemed like silent witnesses to the damage she'd done. She didn't need anyone to point out her mistake. She already knew. This wasn't the kind of betrayal that demanded shouting or slammed doors. It was more insidious, subtle and tangled. A betrayal born not of action, but omission. Of lingering feelings she should have let go long ago, but hadn't. Samuel didn't react with fury. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he kept his gaze on the night beyond the window, his tone calm, too calm. The stillness in him spoke louder than anger ever could, and she understood exactly what it said. The silence between them stretched unbearably long. Then, as if her mouth moved independently of her thoughts, Marina asked, "Do you ever think about what it would be like to run into someone from your past?" The words hung in the air, smoke-like and uncertain. Samuel remained quiet. And in that silence, she found all the answers she needed. Alone with the noise in her own mind, Marina could no longer ignore the unrest in her chest. There was a part of Gavin she had never truly let go of. Their love had been reckless and impulsive, the kind that made no sense and yet consumed everything. They had imagined a future together, whispered potential baby names beneath the sheets, shared promises during rainy evenings. But it all unraveled quickly, with no dramatic goodbye. He'd accepted a job on the other side of the country. When she asked him to stay, he hesitated, and in that pause, she heard a no. So she walked away. It tore her up inside, but she kept moving. Eventually, she met Samuel, steady, kind, dependable. He didn't sweep her off her feet. He didn't speak in poetic declarations. But he was there, every single day. And that presence was exactly what she needed back then. Their love wasn't fiery. It was patient, consistent. It grew quietly. They built a life out of routines and small acts. And she had no reason to doubt it. At least not until Gavin reappeared, with the same piercing blue eyes and the grin that had once made her laugh for no reason. At first, seeing him again felt innocent, harmless. Just two old friends revisiting an unfinished chapter. That's what she told herself. She needed clarity, closure. She wanted to know what had been real. If he had ever truly loved her. If he, too, had wondered about what might have been. Their conversations started light, casual. But they didn't stay that way. Gavin asked questions no one had asked her in years. Was she fulfilled? Did she still write poems? Did she still walk barefoot through the house on lazy Sundays? And that's when something in her began to shift. Because Samuel no longer asked her those kinds of questions. Their world had become full of obligations, of fatigue, of silence. Not because of neglect, but simply because life kept moving. Still, when Gavin looked at her with curiosity that hadn't dulled, she felt seen in a way that shook her. It threw her off balance. She didn't want an affair. She wasn't falling for Gavin again. At least, that's what she told herself. But deep inside, a hollow place she'd ignored for years stirred awake. Gavin had become a mirror she couldn't look away from, and what she saw there unsettled her. She had a solid marriage, 2 daughters, a beautiful home, a husband who was loyal and hard-working. Yet here she was, entertaining dangerous thoughts. And she knew all too well. Thoughts could cut deeper than anything physical. When Samuel still hadn't spoken, Marina rose quietly and walked into the bathroom. She shut the door, leaned her back against it, and finally let herself cry. Not for Gavin. Not even for Samuel. But for the part of herself that had vanished somewhere between school drop-offs and grocery lists. For the girl who once scribbled stanzas on napkins in coffee shops and now struggled to remember why she ever picked up a pen. For the aching need to feel noticed, desired, to be remembered as someone more than just a mother or a wife. She looked at herself in the mirror. Time had left its signature, lines around her eyes, fatigue in her expression, a body softened by the years. But she wasn't lost. Not entirely. There was still a flicker of her old self. A flicker that longed to be better, to make the right choice. To shield the life she'd created from the shadow of what could have been. She wiped her tears, exhaled slowly, and stepped back into the room. Samuel hadn't moved from the window. She wanted to reach for him, to say sorry. But something in her understood that now wasn't the moment. That apologies, if empty, could do more harm than silence. That love, once cracked, couldn't be patched with words alone. So she slipped into bed without a sound, turning her back to him. The space between them felt miles wide, and as the night closed in around them, all she could think was whether there was still time to mend what had started to break, before it shattered beyond repair. Samuel stood there for a long time, unmoving, arms folded tightly, eyes locked on the quiet dark outside. His thoughts collided like thunderclaps, relentless and chaotic. What gnawed at him wasn't envy. It cut deeper, rawer. It was the crushing awareness that the life he had so carefully woven with the woman he cherished, their shared routines, their patchwork of dreams, the raising of their daughters, had been compromised. Just a hairline crack, perhaps, but one that had opened the door to everything he once believed they were immune to. He sank back into the armchair. Marina lay beside him, turned away, her body still and silent. She gave the illusion of sleep, but he recognized the stiffness in her spine. She was waging her own private battle. That, he realized, might be the hardest part to swallow. There had been no explosive betrayal, no villain to point to. No betrayal he could name, just a quiet unraveling. A shift so slow and subtle that by the time it surfaced, the damage had already been done. Like a hidden crack that eventually mars the whole foundation. As the seconds dragged on like hours, Samuel found himself mentally walking through the home they had built together, brick by emotional brick. He saw himself kneeling on the weathered dock, the evening sun setting fire to the sky as he proposed. He could still hear the disbelief in their laughter when they learned they'd be parents, and the fragile miracle of that first tiny heartbeat. He remembered bleary-eyed nights holding their baby against his chest. The lazy weekends filled with pancakes and music. The lean years when they had little but felt rich in love. Now he questioned what, if anything, still stood firm. Not because Marina had crossed an unforgivable line, but because she had allowed someone else to occupy emotional space that once belonged only to them. That changed the equation of trust, of respect, of his identity as her partner. Samuel had always been measured, calm, but his sense of principle ran deep. For him, love wasn't an accident. It was an intentional choice made every day. And fidelity meant more than the physical. It meant guarding each other's hearts, like sacred ground. In that hushed, aching stretch of morning, it hit him. He no longer felt protected. As the first slivers of dawn brushed the sky in amber, he quietly rose and headed to the kitchen. He set the kettle to boil, brewed a pot of coffee, and toasted 2 slices of bread, spreading butter with the muscle memory of years. He wasn't hungry. He just needed a ritual, something predictable, something within reach, when everything else felt out of place. Eventually, Marina entered the room, still dressed in the soft remnants of sleep. Her eyes were puffy, her movements hesitant, like she didn't fully trust the ground beneath her. Without a word, he slid a cup toward her. She whispered a thank you. He said nothing in return. Then, drawing a breath that seemed to weigh down his chest, he began to speak. His tone was low and steady, not bitter, not loud, just certain. Every word was deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed them in the quiet of his own torment. He told her he wouldn't fight for space against the shadow of another man. He wouldn't beg for affection, wouldn't compete for commitment. If Gavin still lingered in her heart or mind, then she needed to confront that without dragging him, or their daughters, into a drawn-out collapse. When she opened her mouth to respond, he gently raised his hand, signaling her to wait. He wasn't finished. He told her the era of ambiguity was over. What he needed now were choices, clear, final ones. So he spelled out his terms. Not in anger, not to threaten, but as the bare minimum necessary to try and restore what had been endangered. If she wanted to remain in the marriage, she had to cut Gavin out completely. No texts, no emails, no casual meetings, no lingering what-ifs. Total closure. She would need to share her location, not because he wanted to monitor her every step, but because broken trust demanded rebuilding, not assumptions. She would also need to start individual therapy, to understand why someone from her past had been able to slip into a place he should never have occupied. And beyond that, they would go to therapy together. Because if there was any hope left, it would have to be earned side by side. And the hardest part, she would need to distance herself from Carmen. He didn't soften the blow. He told her plainly that Carmen had been a corrosive presence, cloaking manipulation in the guise of friendship. Marina listened, silent. Her eyes brimmed, and her fingers clung to the coffee mug like it was the last thing keeping her anchored. When his words came to an end, there was no dramatic eruption, no shouting, no storm of emotions, just a silence so heavy it felt physical, like the room itself was holding its breath. Samuel stood. He gathered their daughters' backpacks, packed their lunches, collected their coats, and set everything neatly by the door. He didn't do it out of spite. This was simply who he was. A man who took responsibility. A father who showed up, even with a heart splintering quietly inside him. At the door, he turned. His voice remained composed, but each word carried weight. Decide what you really want, Marina. Because you can't stay half in the past and half in the present. Eventually, you'll slip into the gap between the two. And then he stepped out. No malice in his voice, just pain. A restrained, dignified sorrow that stung more than fury ever could. Because Marina understood. This wasn't a bluff. He had drawn the line, and that line wasn't going to stay open forever. She stayed seated at the kitchen table long after he left with the girls. Her coffee sat cold and forgotten. The quiet in the room was deafening. She felt empty, like she'd run a marathon only to find herself back at the start. But somewhere in that numb stillness, a sharp clarity began to surface, and through it all, one name kept repeating in her mind. Carmen. Carmen wasn't simply another name in Marina's circle. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention just by entering a room. With a fashion sense that seemed innate, a razor-edge intellect, and a treasure trove of wild stories, Carmen moved through life unbound by convention. No kids, no significant other, no lingering ties. To her, freedom wasn't a choice, it was doctrine. That very wildness, had long held Marina spellbound. In Carmen, she glimpsed a life so unlike her own, perhaps even a version of herself that she'd never dared to explore. They first met at work, during a planning session. Carmen had only just joined the creative department, but within moments, her dry wit had the whole room laughing. Still, it wasn't until their third meeting, a casual night over cocktails, that Marina felt a deeper chord being struck. There was something magnetic about Carmen, something that went beyond charm. She made you feel like you mattered, but somehow always redirected the conversation into waters that were a little darker, a little more daring. That night, Marina heard a question that would echo in her mind for weeks. Carmen, with a playful smile, had asked, "Haven't you ever been curious what it would be like to start over with someone new after all this time?" Marina had chuckled nervously, brushing it off with a firm, "Of course not." But Carmen didn't drop it. Instead, she launched into an animated defense of open relationships, of couples who stayed emotionally loyal while exploring physical freedom. She framed jealousy as a learned response and painted monogamy as more confinement than comfort. Marina attempted to counter with talk of trust, love, and family. But Carmen merely smiled, as though she pitied Marina's certainty, and whispered, "Emotional loyalty is far more brittle than most think. Sometimes a spark is all it takes to ignite a blaze." That evening, Marina returned home unsettled but undeniably stirred. She kept her silence around Samuel. Yet in the days that followed, Carmen's words didn't fade. They embedded themselves somewhere deep within her, quiet but alive, like a seed planted where no one could see. And even the smallest seed, left untouched, will eventually seek the sun. And in a way, Marina did nurture it. Because when Gavin unexpectedly resurfaced, it was as if Carmen's theory had manifested in flesh and blood. Marina didn't fall into his arms. She wasn't overt in her interest, but she didn't close the door either. She allowed herself to feel something, a gentle ache, a flicker of what it felt like to be seen again. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman. Before long, she was entangled in something unspoken. Not physical, not yet, but dangerously intimate all the same. What was unraveling wasn't just her marriage, it was the foundation of who she believed herself to be. Alone one night, Marina came to terms with a hard truth. Carmen hadn't really been a friend. She was more like a storm, arriving when you're already unmoored, pushing you just far enough to lose sight of land. And the most troubling part? She did it beautifully, with elegance, with charm, all under the veil of empowerment. But Marina could now see it for what it was, a clever mask for Carmen's own emptiness. She recalled another recent night when Carmen had declared that marriage was a dead institution, that lifelong monogamy was unnatural, that while men often stray from entitlement, women do so from neglect, and that made it somehow excusable. "You're not only a wife and a mother," Carmen had said with a mischievous grin, handing Marina another glass of wine. "You're so much more than that." Marina had returned the smile, hiding her discomfort behind it. But remembering it now, all she felt was regret. She hadn't been pulled in by trauma or desperation, but by boredom, by the quiet hum of dissatisfaction. And now, she was staring at the very crisis she thought she'd never invite. Still, Marina knew she couldn't pin it all on Carmen. She had allowed this influence into her life, had chosen to keep listening, to let the allure grow. She had adopted a warped idea of what it meant to be free. That's what stung the most, not just the boundary she'd approached, but the small daily betrayals of her own core values. Her heart racing, Marina picked up her phone. She opened WhatsApp and began typing. "Carmen, we need to talk." But after a moment of staring at the words, she deleted them. Exhaled. And then she understood. There was nothing left to say. No conversation that could mend what had been slowly unraveling. She scrolled through her contacts, found Carmen's name, and pressed block. The screen flickered. It was done. No confrontation, no emotional outburst. Just one simple action, yet it marked a turning point. It was the first real step Marina had taken in ages, one rooted not in reaction, but in reflection. For once, she wasn't looking to someone else to define her next move. She was beginning to trust her own voice, the part of her that still believed things could be saved. That night, the silence that filled the bedroom was different. It wasn't sharp with tension or heavy with dread. It carried weight, yes, but underneath it was something else. A tender ache for healing, a fragile belief in the possibility of repair. Marina had spent the day retracing every step, each word with Gavin, every idea Carmen had planted. Memories came rushing in, some painful, all revealing. But for the first time, Marina didn't look at herself through the eyes of others. She saw her own truth, raw and unfiltered. She waited for Samuel to come home, hour after hour, as the living room clock ticked like a soft drumbeat, echoing her remorse. And somewhere in that waiting, something shifted. Marina couldn't predict what the next day would hold. But she knew one thing for sure. If there was still a thread left to hold on to, she would be the one to reach for it, guided not by guilt or restlessness or someone else's idea of liberation, but by the woman she was only just beginning to reclaim. When the key finally twisted in the door, her breath caught in her throat. He stepped inside, the children's backpacks hanging off his shoulder, exhaustion written plainly across his face. He walked past her in silence, offering only the smallest nod before heading straight to the bedroom. His quiet wasn't accidental. It was chosen. He knew that in a moment so fragile, even a single misplaced word might break what little remained between them. Marina drew in a steadying breath and followed. Not because she had some speech rehearsed, but because the silence had grown too heavy to bear. She entered softly. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, methodically untying his shoes. She came closer, dropped to her knees beside him, her eyes brimming. "I'm here," she whispered. "Not because you asked me to be, because I want to be." He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, not with anger or bitterness, but with the kind of stillness that listens. What came next wasn't dramatic or pleading. It was clean and honest. She told him Gavin was gone, completely, permanently. No lingering messages, no drawn-out goodbyes disguised as closure. He had been a part of her history she'd once romanticized, a window she thought led to freedom. But she'd realized he was only ever a reflection, a distorted image of who she used to be and no longer wanted to become again. She talked about ending her relationship with Carmen, too. Admitted that, for far too long, she'd clung to advice that had subtly nudged her away from the life she had built with Samuel. But the most telling moment wasn't in her explanations. It came in the silence before her voice broke, when she confessed that even she didn't fully understand what she had felt. Not from a lack of care, but from a confusion so deep it scared her. That, she said, was the most dangerous kind of mistake. It wasn't the kind born of cruelty, but the kind that creeps in slowly when your guard slips and your heart gets tired. A lapse that left no one else to blame. Only her. She didn't try to justify what she'd done. She shed every excuse, every ounce of ego, and let the truth fall between them, raw and exposed, like someone who knows they've wounded something precious and might never fully heal it. But she was still willing to try. She wasn't fighting to avoid losing her family. She was fighting because she'd looked into the damage she'd caused, and finally understood what she almost destroyed. Samuel remained quiet. He looked at her, but his gaze was distant, as if he were wrestling with the chaos inside himself. He felt emptied. Her honesty hadn't just revealed the betrayal, it confirmed the fear he hadn't dared say aloud, that he had nearly lost her completely. Yet somehow, it also felt like she was trying to return, bruised, ashamed, but reaching back. Slowly, he leaned forward and helped her up from the floor. He asked her to sit with him. The silence that followed no longer cut like a blade. It held space. Not because they were healed, but because, at last, there was room for something true to grow. He didn't offer comforting lies. He didn't say everything was okay. It wasn't. The pain still lingered, and his trust was fragile, like frost on a window pane, liable to shatter with a single breath. But he looked her in the eye and said what she hadn't dared to hope for. "I haven't let go. Now it's up to you. Show me you won't either." The words washed over her, not as forgiveness, but as a sign that the path back still existed. The bridge hadn't collapsed. They were still there, apart but facing one another, willing to rebuild from the ruins. That night, they lay in the same bed, not as lovers chasing comfort, not pretending the damage was undone, but as two people who had survived something that could have ended everything. They lay close, drawn to each other's warmth in the middle of emotional wreckage. As she drifted to sleep, her tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, and without a word, he reached beneath the blankets and took her hand. Just that. A quiet gesture, but to someone standing on the edge, it felt like being pulled back from the brink. A beginning. Fragile, painful, but real. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you liked this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.